Today, bet on Australia is a bet on government. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance and the Listeners Web. Now, this post covering finance and property news. And today I have Tarric Brooker back with me. Hi, Tarric. Welcome back. Great to see you again. And interesting conversation, interesting time of year, and a big question about the role of government in society.
Well, I think that we can all sort of agree on what the government's role should be, but I think that we're sort of encountering a problem where they have a bit of a different viewpoint, where the idea of using, the government money to avoid a recession and to keep inflation elevated is considered a desirable option these days. And not just a desirable option, but it's something to get on ABC and brag about and tell everyone what a fantastic job they're doing. Even though if you drill down into it, things aren't so rosy.
Well, the point, of course, is that the non-market jobs, so-called, are expanding. The share of the economy supported by government is expanding. And in fact, there was a recent article in the AFR that suggested that because of the amount of support that the government was now throwing to households and through other channels, that not only headline inflation, but underlying inflation could actually be impacted, and that might actually get Michelle Bullock to drop interest rates sooner than perhaps expected. But the greater share of the economy effectively being supported by government, it's a bit like the old octopus. It's expanding its tentacles more and more and more. It's squeezing out, crowding out effectively private sector investment. And the problem, of course, is that public sector investment, whilst it might be good and laudable, things like healthcare and ancillary services, doesn't actually generate additional dollars. So effectively what we end up with is an economy that's supported more and more by government spending and less by creating more money, which basically means that on a GDP per capita we go backwards. And in fact, if you start comparing us with other countries, we don't look very flash.
No, we don't. I mean, I think the thing is that Australia has a reputation as being the lucky country from an economic perspective. That we dodge bullets, and that somehow we manage to generally avoid the pitfalls that end up afflicting our rivals. But I think the thing is that when you actually get down into the data, that's not really true. Like for example, here in Australia, since the global financial crisis kicked off in the fourth quarter of 2007, around about a bit over half of all jobs have been those non-market jobs, which the ABS defines as in healthcare and social assistance, public administration, or education and training. So, yet if you look back in time to the 2 decades prior to the financial crisis, so you're looking at the Hawke, Keating, and Howard governments, during that particular era, only about under a quarter of jobs growth was in those sectors. So I think that we've emerged in this situation where we're increasingly reliant on government to drive this jobs growth. And I think the thing is that it's really happened without a lot of people really even noticing it. It's just sort of become the norm. And I think as well, it also comes back to, as you say, what's going on with the economy, what's going on with productivity. Because with weak productivity, that means that there's less potential for wages growth, there's less potential for broader economic growth. And if you look at, say, for example, what per capita household spending looks like when broken down by age demographic, for the average person under 45, they're spending less today than someone in that age cohort was almost 20 years ago. So I think that there's a strong argument to be made that while it props up the economy in headline terms, it doesn't actually benefit the average person in the street. In fact, it's arguably quite detrimental to.
Yeah, and there's another factor in all of this, of course, as well, and that is that those households who are generating income are having to throw more and more and more of it at housing, whether they're in the rental sector or in the mortgage sector. The typical mortgage now is what, 5 to 8 times income. It used to be 3 times. And there was an article I saw the other day that suggested that in Sydney, you might have got away with $80,000 income some years ago. Now you need $200,000 income just to be able to afford anywhere to live. So the other side of all this is we've got incomes being squeezed because of this housing situation. Of course, the government's recently said on Triple J, for example, we don't want house prices to fall. So if you're in the market, you've got houses, then maybe that's not a problem. But if you're somebody trying to get into the market, then you've got this other factor there as well, that in fact, just to get somewhere to live is costing more and more and more. So households are really being squeezed. And I guess the question for me is, what is the right way to assess the health of the economy? Is it really at the top line GDP number, where I think you can always fiddle it a little bit, and whether it's slightly positive, slightly negative. But when you look at real households and what's really going on, that's for me the real lens. And we've got a lot of households who are really caught at the moment in a really big pincer movement. And governments are here to help you. Well, I wonder.
I think that when you look at something, say like housing prices and getting into the market and that and everything, that's something that's varied so dramatically over the years. Like I was looking into the data yesterday night actually, and back in 1999, for 24% of your household of average full-time earnings, you could have bought the median house in Melbourne. For a bit over 30%, you could have bought a house in Sydney. Now, if fast forward to the present, to achieve that level of affordability in Sydney again, and now let's imagine a scenario. The government talks about sustainable housing price rises, which let's say that a sustainable housing price rise is 1.5%. It's completely unrealistic, but let's just say that it's that. And let's say that wages are growing at 2.5%, which is higher than what the pre-COVID 5-year average. At that rate, for someone to buy the median Sydney house and not be in mortgage stress, and this is household income, I might add, not just an average full-time income, it would take till the year 21-24. Now, it sounds like something out of science fiction, but unfortunately, affordable housing here in Australia is fiction. But let's take it a step further. Let's imagine that instead housing prices stop growing at all, which is something that's been put forward by quite a few figures in the media and in academia as a sort of middle of the road solution. If we were to pursue that path, it would take 40 years before the median Sydney house was affordable for the median Sydney household. And I just might add that this is based on the median household income at the census, plus a nice juicy 12% worth of growth in the 3 years since, which I think is pretty generous, all things considered.
Shows you just how unsustainable this whole story is. And like I say, if you're always in the market with multiple investment properties, then of course you want property prices to continue to rise. And of course, from an overall asset perspective, the asset value goes up. So that looks good on the balance sheet of households. But when you actually think of it in real terms, then there's another side here, which is really important to understand. And we've gone way off piste in terms of what's sustainable with regards to property and property prices. And what I find fascinating, Tarric, is that, and I find this quite often when I chat with people who are trying to get into the market, they sort of picture this train which has left the station, and they're trying to run faster and faster and faster to try and jump on the back of the train to try and get on before it's gone over the horizon, as it were. But, at some point, well, you're just going to give it running, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think that that's something that is really detrimental to our society. People need to be able to hope to have their own little slice of the country. Now, this isn't a sort of new idea. This is something that Robert Menzies articulated on the radio back during World War II. That was once upon a time the foundational bedrock of the ideology of the Liberal Party, which is rather insane now to say it, considering the current status quo. But I just think it's interesting, that this is not just an Australian problem. The Canadian opposition leader, the recently made a speech in Parliament in which he said that, to paraphrase, that politicians had betrayed the the dream of Canada, the dream of where if you worked hard, you got a house, you got a yard, you got a place for your kids to play. And I think that that really articulates the heart of the issue here in Australia, that this is an absolutely soul destroying status quo for people. Like 25 years ago, their parents, or even longer ago, their parents were able to go out and buy a property. And, don't get me wrong, a lot of the time it wasn't easy, but it was doable. And they got to have a family, make a life. But here in Australia in 2024, when people are working so hard just to be able to afford an apartment, I think that, and not only that, but, upwards of two-thirds of people don't want to, upwards of two-thirds of people want a house or a townhouse, if not more. And that's after people have said, I'll make a compromise because of price. I think that there are a lot of people out there who are deeply unhappy with the status quo, and that this is really affecting their mental health. And I just think it's just affecting our society, or infecting our society more broadly.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. And I've been talking about this issue for more than 20 years because, when I was starting to do my household surveys, I was watching the uptick in terms of some of the pressures building. But more importantly, I could see where this was going because it had been playing out in similar fashion in the UK and elsewhere, where effectively more and more of people's income is sucked into trying to actually get somewhere to live. House prices accelerate, and superficially that looks good, but actually in real terms it doesn't actually take you to where you want to get to. And ultimately you get to the point where more people are getting squeezed out. Look at the tent cities in Australia at the moment. And so it shows you that this is another example of broken policy over, several decades now, very hard to unwind. And so, of course, the government jumps to, well, it's a supply issue because that's somebody else's problem. And, we'll throw a bit of money into first-time buyers to try and help them a little bit so we can say we're doing something politically, but not solving the problem. And ultimately, this becomes a bigger and bigger millstone around the economy. And I guess the other millstone that sort of follows on from that then is the inflation story, right, which is still not dead. And inflation is being propped up by high rental costs, of course, at the moment still, as well as high costs of building and construction for new development. So we can see how this all sort of goes around in a bit of a circle and makes it more and more difficult to navigate the economy overall, and end up effectively money going in the wrong places and ordinary people just being caught in the crossfire.
I wonder sometimes if we are not reaching, but heading for a point where, I'm not going to quite call it a death spiral, but it's akin to it, whereby you hit such a point where, say, for example, building a new home gets so expensive that only a fraction of the people that a much smaller fraction of people can actually afford to do it. That basically entrenches low supply growth, whether you want it or not. Now, of course, the landowners could take a haircut, but this is Australia. This isn't America, or a place with a more free market where things would sort of shift to a new equilibrium. No, we don't do that here. So the question then becomes, how does society function under those conditions where the government just says, we don't care how many households are being created. We don't care what number of homes is actually being demanded in reality. Now, this is all in the ABS data. This isn't something, that's esoteric or abstract. This is all their hard data, in bold, bright letters, if they want it that way. Yet they continue on this, like, even, for example, even if we manage to get migration down to 260,000, as they suggested it would be in the mid-year budget, it's still too high. it's still way too high for the current state of the Australian housing market and the enormous housing deficit we have. And as I just mentioned, we're in a situation where even as rates fall, the bounce back in the housing construction sector is going to be much, much more muted than it would have been historically. So we're stuck in this situation where supply growth is going to be low and demand growth is going to be high. Yet both choices are being made by government.
Yeah. Well, this is what I keep coming back to. This is a set of policies that have been rolled out over the last 20, 30 years. And I suppose you could talk about the negative gearing tax breaks. You can talk about the high migration. You can talk about the deregulation of the financial system, the financialization of property, all of those things, and a lot of other things too. All, of course, taking us away from the idea that a human right is to have somewhere to live, right? So it's now for those who can afford it. And we've got to the point now where less and less people are able to afford it, and more people then are looking for government support by way of rental support, or trying to find a way in through the old first owner grants. Trouble is, all of those just make the problem worse, and none of the strategies being spoken about now, maybe other than dialing back migration more firmly, really aren't going anywhere close, which of course then means, well, so how much higher would you like house prices to go, right? So, we're 8 times income now. What do you want? 15 times income? 20 times income? Where is the ceiling?
Oh, that's the question, mate. And I think the problem is that we're reaching a scenario now where you're not talking organically buying homes anymore.
No.
For the most part. Like if you talk about just market entrance, because obviously people who are in the market, they've already got equity, they've already rode the bubble. So, their experience is vastly different. But if you're talking about people just getting into the market, up to 75% of receiving some form of family or some form of assistance from friends or family. Another third are getting assistance from the federal government. Further still, are getting assistance from the state and territory governments. So we're in a situation where organic home ownership, where a couple or an individual just go out and buy a property without anyone else standing in the background at the auction, without Albo or mum and dad standing behind them, that doesn't really happen anymore. So I think that that's really just worth reflecting on as we go forward. Just that. So it's like, well, what happens next? We're burning through the scope of the bank of mum and dad, and we're burning through the treasury. What next?
Exactly. How much of total spending in an economy should actually the government control and direct is actually part of what the question is here, right? Because we're at an all-time high at the moment. A lot of that is actually directly or indirectly supporting households or supporting people trying to get into property, et cetera, et cetera. So, how big does the octopus get? How much of the economy is actually public sector? And do we end up ultimately with no private sector at all?
Well, then that's the thing. There needs to be a private sector because someone has to pay the taxes and generate the revenue to be able to actually drive this, to be able to facilitate this spending. I mean, I think the thing is if you look at other countries, and this is something that I'm currently working on for an article, it'll be out either over the weekend or next week on my website at burnout-economics.com. If you look at the numbers, this sort of non-market job growth that we're seeing here in Australia isn't really possible in other countries because they just don't have the budgetary scope to do so, because either they already have too much debt or there's just not enough revenue. So there's that real sort of issue that we've had in over the last couple of years where we've had all this extra revenue, we've had the bounty that we have been afforded by circumstance, by the war in Ukraine, by the accidental underspend on infrastructure and services because migration was way too high. Surprise. So we've had all this extra money. The Treasury has had all this extra money for the government to be able to spend. But as we've seen with the mid-year budget, that gravy train is now running out, and we're heading back into the world of large large deficits. So where do we go from there? Are we going to start borrowing to pay for this sort of job creation? I mean, debt levels are low, the scope is there. We could probably get away with it for a decade if we really wanted to.
Well, I thought it was fascinating in the MAIFO that there was a lot of, if you like, off-budget stuff that was actually not really included in the numbers that people looked at, but actually was a big number. They've also, of course, got a hollow log or two thanks to the assumption in terms of lower commodity prices than actually are likely to happen. So they've got some ability to sort of throw more money in there. But and Chalmers did say, well, actually, compared with some other countries, our debt levels are relatively low. So, we've still got some capacity if we need to do it. But you've got to ask the question, what shape is the economy going to be in if more and more of what is going on at the moment is effectively supported directly or indirectly by government? Where does the money come from? Well, it's from taxpayers. Okay, so we've now got the situation where effectively we've got money coming into taxpayers through one source and is being taken back through tax. And so you've got this sort of perpetual cycle of, or is it a feedback loop, but not actually creating new value through the process, which is why productivity stinks. This is not a sign of an economy that's heading in the right direction, which is why this is such a critical conversation. But I guess we should probably just touch also on the broader inflation issue, and your slides, of course, really come in quite handy here, Tarric, because you've got the old, this is Jerome Powell saying inflation isn't really a big problem, right? Well, is it?
Well, as usual, the charts will be available at burnouteconomics.com. If you would like to be a free or paid subscriber there, that would be very, very much appreciated. Or you can make a one-off contribution. That would be a very, very nice little gift underneath my Christmas tree. And without further delay, we shall get right into it. Now, this is a chart of what at any given time over the last two and a bit years, what proportion of GDP growth at that point had been due to government. So this is government spending or government investment across all levels of government and public corporations. And, well, I think this one pretty much speaks for itself, actually.
It's going up, as we were saying earlier on, to, well, is it a record now? It looks like it.
Well, I mean, there's the wars.
Yeah.
So technically speaking, on that count, that's a pretty tough one to beat. And there's also technically recessions. So obviously, when the private sector is contracting, this has happened before in that regard. But the thing is, this isn't actually a recession. So, and part of the issue with recessions as well is because the private sector is contracting, even if the public sector only just marginally expands, it's obviously, infinity times larger than a negative number. So, but I just think that, that we've just reached this very different point here in Australia than we are the lucky country that everything always goes right, when in actual fact, there's a whole lot of stuff going on behind the scenes to support this somewhat illusionary status quo.
And by the way, of course, that means it's government borrowing, and government borrowing, of course, costs, and with interest rates much higher than previously, the greater share of government spending on interest payments continues to be a problem.
Well, I think that something sort of on that count needs to be sort of clarified, just in the sense that, yes, the federal government has had this enormous windfall from commodity prices, from the aforementioned underspend on infrastructure and services. But behind the scenes, state debt has been rising in a lot of different instances.
And Victoria.
Not only that, sorry,
Victoria.
Yeah, well, exactly. And not only that, but if you look at it, state spending has also been rising. You look at Queensland, like 30% of state final demand in Queensland is public sector.
Yeah, absolutely. It's remarkable. And the total debt burden of the country is, of course, not just federal, but also the state burdens. And those burdens are continuing to rise. The question is, how are they going to get paid?
Indeed. We'll go on to the next slide. Now, I've had a lot of questions over time on comparing the Australian and US migration rates. Now, generally speaking, in years gone by, this was a relatively easy calculation to do, relatively pedestrian. But with the surge in undocumented migrants coming across the border, that has complicated matters significantly until now. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics earlier in the week put out their estimates on total US net migration, including the impact of undocumented migrants. Now, this may be underestimating the level of migration of that variety, and maybe underestimating it significantly. But as of today, this is roughly the best estimate that we have. And I think it just illustrates how huge Australia's migration intake remains, even though this particular data point is the latest figure for Australia at 400, which was the latest migration rate of 445,000.
Yeah, and I did notice that there were some different and conflicting data points coming out from the Australian sources that had a gap of about 100,000 in terms of how big the migration pool actually is. I suppose it depends on how you measure it, but I'm interested that they're always trying to find a way of saying, oh no, it's not really that big.
Well, that was the gap between the national accounts estimate of the population and the broader population estimates. I mean, revisions aren't really that surprising, but I mean, at the end of the day, you've still got migration at 445K, and as this chart sort of illustrates, it's still, well, it's about half of what the US rate is now, and about 3 times what the developed world norm is in an average year.
Mm.
So I just think that that's sort of, you know what, I'm just going to go to the next chart. People say that Australia should be more like Norway. I agree with them. Let's be more like Norway. And I just might add that this is actually a chart of pre-COVID levels of migration for Australia, not the latest data. I'd need something that has a much, much greater y-axis to illustrate that. But I just think that just goes to show, that we are not normal, despite this idea of, you are prejudiced if you don't agree with the status quo. Well, that makes pretty much every developed world nation on the planet prejudiced. So it's just complete nonsense.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Dutton, of course, has pedaled back from his. Oh no, we're going to take migration all the way down. We're not going to say anything about migration levels now until after the next election, which I thought was quite interesting.
That was a bit disappointing. I feel like I just embrace my inner parent when I say I'm not surprised. I'm just disappointed.
Yep, very good.
All right. Now, this is market versus non-market based jobs for Australia since the Albanese government's election in Q2 2022. And yeah, this is another one that pretty much speaks for itself, actually.
Mm. Well, as we said earlier on, of course, the non-market jobs are important jobs, healthcare and what have you, but they don't actually create additional dollars for the economy. They basically cycle the same dollar around the place a bit. And, they're important. But if we end up with more and more of the economy effectively government supported, then the economy becomes less and less productive, which is what we've seen. And that is a one-way path to nowhere very comfortable.
I think the thing is that if we were talking about okay, here's one for you, right? Let's imagine that we want to bring in a whole bunch of nurses, right? That we want to bring in, people who make a huge, huge, huge difference to the day-to-day quality of life for Australians, for people, in care or people in need. But so we need nurses. I actually figured out the other day that total non-market jobs growth in Australia was almost identical to the total non-market jobs growth for the last 12 months was almost identical to to every single nurse and midwife of any persuasion in the entire country. So you could literally double the number of nurses with the number of non-market jobs that we've created in the last 12 months alone. Now, did we? Did we bring in a whole heap of nurses? Oh my no. The actual number of nurses was well under 20,000 in the last data. And I think it was about 13 or 14,000. So don't get me wrong, a decent sized number, but broadly just keeping up with population growth and the needs of an aging population to an insufficient degree. And that's obviously not the nurses' fault. They're doing the best that they can. But unfortunately, the government has made that choice and made their lives and our lives more challenging.
Well, actually, and some of the breakdowns that I looked at suggested that a lot of the jobs that were actually there were actually in the public sector, directly or indirectly, right? But there wasn't necessarily sort of frontline jobs. It was more sort of administrators and and middle managers and those sorts of things. The stuff that tends to sort of expand, well, when you don't look, and expand even more when you do look, in the government systems. So it doesn't necessarily give you even better services at the end of the day.
You know, one thing that I find sort of insane about all of this is I think about the sort of progress of technology, right? That back in the day, a medical report would have been done by a typist or a typewriter, that there would have been, no computer assistance, records would have been kept manually, all of these things would have been done in a very, very mechanical way. Yet these days we have all this amazing technology, but we need even more administrators than we needed when everything was done, with a typewriter today by several orders of magnitude. And I just find that quite striking, really. The fact that we should be finding all these amazing efficiencies, but we don't. Although, by the same token, at the end of the day, who is going to, if we did magically find all these efficiencies, if we did manage to sort of create and streamline the public sector, who's going to employ all these people?
Well, that's right. And of course, that's a AI question, but it was a paperless office question from a few decades ago as well. I remember people saying previously, oh, well, we won't need anyone in the office anymore, right? So, now all the paper's gone. We seem to be managing to be, remarkably inefficient despite the emergence of technology and computers and AI and everything else. So I'm a bit skeptical of the benefits of some of this stuff in terms of, easing the path. Maybe at the margin it's true, but it doesn't seem to really turn it around that much.
I think part of the problem is that we're just not with like we are not pursuing a strategy of efficiency. We're just we just seem to be creating more and more, what do they call them, bullshit jobs. And I mean, don't get me wrong, it employs people, it gives people something to do, and it gives people an income. But is that the best path for our society? Are we better off not just having a different society that's more efficient, but perhaps, with that extra efficiency dividend, manages to pay people to have an otherwise comfortable life? I mean, I think that's an interesting philosophical question.
So we need the Department of Government Efficiency. Now, where have I heard that before?
Well, look, if they actually manage to achieve it, all I can say is good luck to them. But in my experience, and I've known quite a few people who've worked in government for cumulatively several centuries. Normally, what ends up happening, and this is something that you can even look up yourself if you would like to, viewers. But what happens, say for example, in the UK, is when government gets cut, frontline services get cut.
Yep.
And the turkeys, who are the ones who are managing things, don't vote for Christmas. They
Yep.
keep them and their mates in place. The public sector doesn't get any smaller, but things get worse.
And
And
then,
I really want to know how we avoid that.
and of course, they also employ ex-public servants as consultants. which is the other way of doing it. So you move into the private sector and then you get employed back as a consultant or a contractor at a higher rate than previously. And so you end up spending even more for the same things that you got before, except they're now not public sector, they're private sector. So the numbers look good, but aren't good. So there are so many traps to the unwary here that I'm also a bit skeptical of whether you will see much efficiency. And as you say, it's frontline services that get chopped because they're the easy bit.
Yeah, and I mean, like, just on the topic of consultants and stuff like that, in Australia, at a federal level, a study found, I believe it was last year, that through the employment of consultants and outsourcing, the federal public service was actually 37% larger in reality than it was on paper.
Yep.
So while the Morrison government and the coalition, who were sort of in power during most of the growth of this particular trend, can say, well, look, at a per capita level, we shrunk the public service. It's like, yeah, but did you? Did you really? No.
You can take the numbers a number of different ways, and you can make spin the story the way you want it, but that's not reality, right? Which, of course, is what happens. There's a lot of people in government who are in the Ministry of Spin directly or indirectly.
Yeah, I mean, the money's good.
Spot on.
Speaking of spin, perfect. That was a perfect segue. I love it. This is a chart of the rolling rate of 12-month public housing approvals. Now, every now and then you'll see a tweet from Albo or members of his cabinet, or even backbenchers, talking up how fantastic their public housing plan is and how it's going to improve and how everything's going to be fantastic and hunky-dory, and they're going to expand public housing by this untold amount. But when you actually get down into the approvals at the ABS, they're lower than they were when Morrison left office. Now, you can say, well, it's lags, it's this, it's that. That big, giant spike there occurred after the Rudd government, during the GFC, engaged in their public housing, their major public housing building program. That peak there was about 13 or 14 months after Rudd announced the policy. Now, Albo's had more than enough time to be able to at least start to see the beginnings of the rise, but it's not there. And it's just that, like, as you mentioned, there's just a whole lot of spin.
Yeah, and just on that, if you were to then overlay migration, so population growth, over that same period, then in terms of per capita, it will be even worse, right? Because effectively the population's gone through the roof.
Absolutely, and that's been, with the exception of that surge there under Rudd, that's pretty much been the case of the share of public housing continuing to shrink and shrink and shrink.
Yeah.
Now, just interesting side note on this: the Commonwealth rent assistance basically didn't used to exist once upon a time.
Yep.
It was something that went to a very, 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 very select group of people like war widows and the like, and was later massively expanded to the sort of, well, misguided policy that it is today. Because, so basically rent assistance costs all this untold billions, and we, instead of just building public housing, we give people money to pay private landlords with government cash. Now that's never really made sense to me, because we could have just built more public housing, had people in public housing paying rent to the government. And not only that, but this is Australia. We have government intervention to prop up housing prices. You've literally got a giant perpetual motion machine. If you want it, all you got to do is just build houses, and then you intervene and prop up the housing prices, and then they rise in value, and then you can sell them, and then you can pay off the debt, and it just keep going forever and ever. So, it just doesn't make much sense to me.
No, I agree with that. And of course, if you are in the private rental sector, you'll be doing it tough already. I'm sort of seeing some investors getting out because they can't make it work anymore. But I'm also seeing quite a few other people thinking, well, this is a good time to buy because prices are sliding again, and we'll leverage up some more and Trouble is, of course, that those rents are significantly above what people can afford. And then, of course, the buy-to-let sector, the build-to-let sector, which is now being spoken about, and the bill was passed quite recently. Well, that's going to actually make it even worse because they are not going to offer very much cheap housing. Most of it's going to be more expensive housing because they're going to be looking for people who can pay bigger rents. So the whole housing story is, again, an example of a broken strategy.
And I'd say that it's a willfully broken one as well. I mean, like my entire adult life, I've been hearing it's a supply issue. It's a supply issue. Well, no one has ever done anything meaningful about supply. No one has looked at things and gone, "Oh my God, the building sector's gotten bloated. This is costing people a heap of money. This is costing builders money. It's costing developers money. It's costing consumers money. We could even drop inflation some more and get the RBA to cut rates even more. And wouldn't that be fantastic?" But that's not what happens. They don't address the supply issue. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And frankly, I don't see that there's any appetite for that to really change, unfortunately.
No, I agree. For reasons we discussed earlier, it's unlikely to change. But then, what is the ceiling? How high can prices go relative to income? There'll be one person who can have sufficient income to be able to buy a property. So at some point in the future, right, and more people will be looking on from their tents or from their cars, thinking, well, this is just the normal course now. We're never going to be owning that stuff called property. That's for other people. That's not for us. And I do think that we've got ourselves in the situation where we've normalized tent cities. That's ridiculous. We've normalized the concept of people living in their cars. Unacceptable.
Well, I think the thing that's really, really messed up about all of this is that we're not just talking about people who are on a public housing waiting list, who are on, or who are on some form of income assistance payment, which people generally associate with that type of outcome. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that that is in any way justified, but that is something that people in society have generally come to accept. But we're talking about people with full-time jobs here,
yep,
who just can't get a roof over their heads. We've taken, just probably half a dozen more steps down a very, very bad road. And I think one of the things that really gets me about it is you've got the government, you've got Chalmers getting up there and saying, "Haven't we done such a fantastic job keeping the economy out of recession?" And it's like, dude, if not for the ginormous amount of migration, which is playing a significant role in the current housing crisis, in driving up the rates of homelessness, in driving up rents, and driving up inflation, you would have had a recession. So what you're saying is, I've made a choice. Aren't I amazing? Pause, deal with it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, of course, the next thing, I wonder which state will be first, will be to actually start charging the tent city owners for the square meterage that they're using of public space for their tent. I'm just waiting for that to happen.
I sit here and I think that's so messed up. There's no way that could possibly happen. But then I remember that this is Australia and that dumber things have happened.
Yep. Well, some of them are using public facilities, It's, I don't know.
That we are a nation that gave $188 billion of basically free money to the banks to then drive up property prices even more in the middle of a pandemic. And then when the banks didn't need to end up lending it all, they parked it back at the RBA and collected interest on it.
Yep.
That's how stupid the decision making in this country can be.
Well, let's just add to that 300 billion plus for submarines that won't land for another 20 years or whatever it is. And then a dozen 300 billion for nuclear power, if you believe the numbers. And you think, hang on a moment, where are the priorities?
Yeah, and where's the money?
Yep.
Oh,
Crazy, crazy.
all right. Yeah. Well, speaking of crazy, as I mentioned previously, under the Hawke, Keating, and Howard governments, non-market employment as a proportion of overall employment was relatively stable, very much bouncing around between a range of 22 and about 23%. Then, as the GFC took hold and things got a bit more difficult, governments at a state and federal level turned to this type of employment to grow jobs, and it hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped under either side at any point. So it's just continued to march upwards. Its trend has just continued to march upwards. So I think it's just really worth emphasizing that this isn't a liberal issue. It's not a Labor issue. It's an Australian government issue at a state and federal level.
No, absolutely. It's horrendous. And when you see it on a chart like that, you think, oh my goodness me, how can they have got to this state of play? Well, the answer is policy.
It is, and I think it's also just a case of just acceptance, really. I mean, this is something that I only really, saw as a major issue in like the last couple of years. I mean, you're someone who's been covering this for a lot longer than I have and noticed it, but that this is just an accepted cost of doing business. But I think that we're fast approaching a point where we can't really keep growing the size of this particular ranks of employment without downside. And without going off on too much of an angry ranting tangent, as I said previously, when cuts come, they don't really in Australian history come for the gravy train. Then they don't come for the private equity firms who found a way to make a government policy deeply profitable to them. Like there are all manner of dumb government policies that cost the taxpayer billions that are ineffective, that don't work, that everyone knows they don't work, yet they remain in place anyway. So, I think that people say to me, well, at least people have jobs. And it's like, okay, yes, they have jobs. When the time comes, it's not going to be the people on the gravy train who get cut. It's going to be the nurse, the doctor, the copper, the fireman that you need that ends up getting cut. Because that's exactly what happened in Britain when they tried to address this sort of problem.
Absolutely. Well, there's still big issues in the UK with regards to the lack of frontline workers. And, even now with high migration in the UK, migration isn't as a proportion of population as high Australia, but it's quite high. But some of these policies, get trotted out. But I want to come back to just one other thing you said. There is a lot of money that governments throw at big corporates at the moment. Look at the mining sector, look at the gas sector, look at what we should have been recovering from the LNG sector. We're not. We should be actually recovering a significant amount of money from that sector, but we're not. So bad policies, thanks maybe to heavy lobbying from some of these corporate sectors, makes it very difficult for governments to do the things they should be doing, and so they look around for other things to do, and so we end up with these bad policy decisions. But in a cumulative effect, over time, you end up with an economy that's just stagnating.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is that because there is all these gravy trains, like they cost money. They cost tens of billions of dollars. Cumulatively cost tens of billions, if not over $100 billion a year. Now don't get me wrong, not all of it's gravy train, but a lot of it is.
Yep.
And you have to you have a nation has to be wary of that and not just sort of pacified by the idea of, oh well, it's at least some of it is going to help people, when it should be, well, all of it should be going to help people, and people should be, and not only that, but then the taxpayer should be getting value for money, because it's ultimately, all our money.
Absolutely. Well, I remember the mineral rent resources tax and all of the scare advertising that they put out when that was being spoken about, and the way that big business actually, use public pressure as well as private lobbying to protect their own interests. And sometimes I think that the problem is that those massive interests, which are costing an arm and a leg for the economy, are ruling the roost. So, I wonder sometimes who's actually really calling the shots when it comes to policy and to power. And to the extent to which governments can or can't do things, it's about whether they upset the big bit end of town or not. And if they do, they've got issues. If they manage to continue to throw money at them, then they'll be quiet and therefore we can carry on. So, to my mind, the budget doesn't tell you the full story with regard to where has the money gone.
No. And just on that sort of topic of vested interests, the Australia Institute put out an interesting poll today. And, for those wondering, it was actually done by a global market research firm. It wasn't done by the Australia Institute themselves, which a few people have raised that issue with me. Now, it asked people, would they prefer housing prices rise or housing prices fall? Now, a majority of people say they want housing prices to fall. A large majority of people who aren't property investors want housing prices to fall. So I think that we've just got this funny situation where the government doesn't want to annoy what is in reality a minority of people, but they're likely to be a very angry, very vocal minority of people who are effectively influencing the one of the most major policy outcomes of our country.
No, it's very interesting. Well, the same issue, as soon as negative gearing reform was, popped up again, they got really, really, vocal about it. And so that had to be hit on the head relatively quickly from a political perspective. So it does seem as though there's a innate sensitivity within the political system for some of these issues. And I wonder sometimes whether it's because of vested interests, maybe because politicians have a lot of investment properties, or whether it's just that they are such a vocal sector of society, and of course well oiled as well from a cash perspective, so they can make a big fuss, and that's not a fuss that governments want to create.
Well, all I can say is that Albo and Chalmers went on a very, very swift caving expedition once that it was brought to public light that they were even considering touching the sacred cows.
Yes, it was the third rail. It remains the third rail of politics, doesn't it? Don't touch it.
Well, one thing that I thought was interesting, just side note, in that Australia Institute polling, that if you actually look at the people who are going to vote for One Nation or who are going to vote for independence, they actually favor falling housing prices over rising housing prices by more than 2 to 1.
Hmm.
So I just think it's interesting that that wanting higher housing prices is very much a mainstream view. And I would also add that the only group of voters by party who does want rising housing prices in aggregate. So a majority of those people, or more people want rises than want falls, is the coalition.
Yep.
Which I thought was rather interesting.
Yep. Well, maybe that goes back to Dutton's change of tune with regard to migration. We can't allow housing prices to fall, can we? And look, if you think of property as a financial investment instrument, that's one story. If you think of property as a human right and as a requirement to have somewhere to live, that's another angle. Those two things can't necessarily sit very comfortably together. And I think the problem is that we've swung way too far to the financialization of property rather than seeing property as a human right and somewhere to live. That's where we should be heading back towards. But that's an uphill task. But frankly, that shouldn't stop us trying.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that, because if you look at it from both perspectives, let's say that property is solely a financial asset, right? But it's just, an asset like a stock or a crypto coin or whatever. Then there's no reason for government to intervene.
Mm.
In fact, government intervention goes against the very nature of a market, of a free market, of a financialized asset. They shouldn't be touching it.
Yep.
It's something that they should just be leaving the hell alone. But then if you take it to the other perspective, which is people need a house to live and that it should be affordable, then they shouldn't be screwing with it because it's a place for someone to live. So, I mean, whatever way you look at it, it's wrong. It's just it's absurd. I mean, when you really think about it, just the idea of, oh, hey, the government's intervening to prop up the housing market. It's just like, what? How does that work in a free market capitalist economy? Unless we're not a free market capitalist economy.
Well, I suspect we're probably in a less free market than we might think we are. But, the analogy is very good because which government would actually intervene in the stock market to support particular stocks, for example? If they started doing that, people would be horrified. And yet that's precisely what's going on in the housing sector at the moment, right? With massive amount of money directly and indirectly going into this situation. So we've got ourselves in this massive bind. And that's why I've always believed that the only way out is to be much more bullish in terms of, alternative strategies and alternative approaches. But you're going to upset people on the way. And politicians don't want to upset voters just for an election, do they?
No, but I feel like, part of our conversation today, when we just posted certain charts or had certain things or said certain things, that we just need to just have the Soviet national anthem just playing in the background, just bombastically just going off tap as, we talk about, this government intervention and things that goes well beyond what should be normal in a capitalist economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've always held the view that free market capitalism is the least worst of all the different economic systems that are around the place, right? But the more that you get governments intervening and trying to sort of rig the table and put the fingers on the scale, you end up with, collateral damage, and you end up with effectively a lot of bad outcomes and very few good outcomes. And there are winners and losers on all of that. The trouble is that if the winners are the most vocal and the ones that governments rely on ultimately to get re-elected, then they're going to do more of it because they've realized that that's actually the way to get back into power. And of course, politicians are all about power more than anything else. So there's a really important rug here to unpick, right? To understand how we got to where we got to and how we could change the game to be able to actually get somewhere different. But that would take political intestinal fortitude. And I wonder sometimes whether the politicians really want to do it.
No. I mean, I think that some do. But I get the feeling that at the top that they're either not interested in rocking the boat, or they fear upsetting the apple cart too much and the potential consequences of that.
Yeah, well, I do find it interesting that when you're in opposition, you can actually be a bit freer. And talking to some of the independents, who actually do see a lot of these issues, that they will relatively easily concede that actually when you're in government, and you've got Treasury breathing down your neck and other things going on there, it's really hard to get some of those reforms through, which are an interesting question. I think the next election will be really interesting next year, Tarric, as to what extent some of the smaller parties, gain more momentum. Both of the major parties seem to me to be sort of quite close together on many policy issues. So that'll be fascinating as well. And I just remind everybody that Starmer got back in the UK with 1/3 of the votes and 2/3 of the seats because it one past the post system, and he's messed it up since then. So elections don't necessarily lead you to a good outcome either. So, well, that's good news or bad news for 2025, but it's worth just reflecting on.
Indeed. Okay, this is a good chart from AMP on basically just the continued fall in the rate of productivity growth. And unfortunately, as productivity growth goes, so too does economic growth.
Yep.
And yeah.
I mean, it speaks for itself, doesn't it? We've been saying this for some time. This means that in real aggregate terms, people are going backwards from, a wealth perspective, despite what everybody thinks in terms of house prices. And why? Because of what we've been saying earlier on. The fact is that we've got less productive activity in the economy.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this is part of why there's less productive activity in the economy. This is a chart also from AMP that shows the capacity to pay for a house, which is in the blue and on the right-hand scale, and the actual sale price of a house, which is in the red and on the left-hand scale. And I think that this just illustrates something that the RBA recently mentioned, in the sense that normally when you see a sizable drop in the ability for a household to purchase a home, housing prices follow. But that wasn't allowed to happen in this cycle because that would have been inconvenient.
Yeah, well, house prices do seem to be wobbling in some areas, but we'll see how this plays out. But this really just speaks to this gap, this massive gap between ability to pay. And I come back to this again and again and again. So I see it in my surveys that the ability for people to afford somewhere to live is just getting more and more adverse, and no real change on the horizon, I think.
I just think it's funny that the government then turns around and looks and just looks dumbfounded as they go, why aren't people having kids?
Yeah.
And it's like, there you go.
Exactly.
People need stable places to live. They need affordable. They need an affordable cost of living. And are you providing any of that? And I'm not even talking about mortgage rates. Just mean in general. Like, even if mortgage rates get cut by like a sort of historically normal, let's call it 1.5, 1.6% in terms of the relative move in mortgage rates, that's not really saving too many people, to be honest.
No, absolutely not. No, well, we've hit the hour, Tarric. I don't know whether you've got more you want to say or whether you want to tie the ribbon on it here, but this has been a very concerning conversation at one level, but also as we come into 2025, I suspect we're going to hear a lot more about this as we head to the election.
Yes, well, if we can indeed tie a bow on it, and there will be plenty more to talk about in the coming year. And with the election coming up, I have a feeling that we're going to be quite busy in that regard, because at most it's what 6 months away. So it's not long now, especially if Albo wants to avoid the potential further budget downside revisions. And although maybe he'll get lucky and he'll get a rate cut from Bullock for Christmas.
Well, he has got a couple of members now on this new board, which will come out later on. So, yeah, it may swing it. But I noticed that I think it's 7 of 9 are still the old guard, as it were. So I'm not sure it will be sufficient to really move the dial that much. And with the Fed basically dialing back from 4 to 2, and with the inflation impulse looking as though it's coming back, I'm a little bit more skeptical than Summers that we're going to see an early rate cut next year. We'll see about that too.
Well, I think it's going to come down to how much Albo and Chalmers can twist Bullock's arm.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah,
because I don't think that we're really going to have all that much sort of super positive things for a rate cut. That is mostly because employment growth is likely to stay strong. And I will say just one thing before we end is that be careful, viewers, with the upcoming employment data. That's a mistake I made last year, thinking that things were more dire than they actually are. It's just seasonally broken, and I wouldn't really put too much stock in it until we get further into 2025.
So just to be clear, not seasonally adjusted, seasonally broken, right? In other words, the trends of the past aren't necessarily the trends of the present. We've also got, of course, more people working multiple jobs, and that's one of the reasons why the hours work is where it is. And we also still get quite big revisions from those numbers. So I agree with you, Tarric, that you can't really build a good strategy off those. It's sandcastles from top to bottom, really, when it comes to those numbers.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the way it is. But also, if it's not the case, if it does continue to show extremely strong growth, then Albo's really not getting his rate cut.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Tarric, I want to say firstly, thank you very much for all your contributions through the year. And I know it's been a difficult year for you in many ways, but I'm glad you were able to pony up from time to time and join us on the show here. I know our viewers really love your dissertations and slides and what have you, and your opinions. I hope you have a chance to take a bit of time off over Christmas and New Year, and I'll look forward to having you back on the show in the new year when you can make it. And we should wish seasonal greetings to all our viewers and followers. Follow Tarric as well on his Burnout Economics platform. It's a really, really important source of information. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the new year, Tarric.
No, well, thank you for the kind words, Martin, and Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever makes you happy, folks. And I wish you all the best for 2025. And I just want to say thank you for watching, and thank you for all your support throughout the year. It genuinely does mean the world to me. Have a good one, folks.
Great. Thanks, Tarric. And yes, appreciate all the support, all the comments, and all the requests when Tarric doesn't appear for a few weeks. Where's Tarric? Is it Tarric time? We'll try and endeavour to have some Tarric time over the next few weeks as well. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tarric. Have a very, very good Christmas, New Year, and we'll see you next year.
Catch you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.